Here are two dumb questions. First dumb question, who's more in charge of the church, Mary or Peter? Equally dumb question, number two, who is more important, Mary or Peter? Even though the questions might be odd, dumb, answering them will give us direction as to how we might become better disciples of Jesus. Stay tuned not only for the answers, but to find out why the questions are indeed dumb. We've all heard of the Synod on Synodality, that worldwide gathering convened by Pope Francis. One of the writings coming from a study group in that recent synod, the group studying the role of women in the church, is what led me deeper into this issue, and something I want to share with you. In a few words, the two dumb questions are about what are called the Marian Principle and the Petrine Principle. Now, right up front, note that the view of dividing participation in the church into these two principles, or even asserting that they exist, is controversial. For some, the idea of a distinctive Marian or Petrine principle is a subterfuge, that the idea of these two principles is born from condescension. Objectors see the distinction as a sop, a concession to women, telling them in effect, oh, don't worry about not being ordained or fully engaging in the Petrine principle of administration. You have the Marian principle. You don't need the Petrine principle. I don't think that's a fair characterization of what's at hand with these two principles, but we do have to acknowledge that the construct of these two principles needs to be credible for the principles to be useful for anyone. If there are objections, well, let's just meet them head on. So, the Marian principle, what is it? Maybe the best way into this is to note some concrete particulars of Mary's life. In telling this, I want to acknowledge that many of the words that follow are taken from the Synod Study Group's report. Also, the report acknowledges and quotes that 20th century theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, and he's identified as the formulator of this theology of the Marian and Petrine principles. So just as the study group quotes Balthasar, so do I. I'll put links to all this in the description below. First, note that as a matter of history, the church begins with the yes of Mary of Nazareth, her yes, an unreserved readiness to accept in complete freedom what is asked of her. But this yes was not a one-off occurrence in her life. Not only was that first yes a single event in history, but it was also her continuing way of life, her service, never wavering, never seeking repayment, is a principle, an ongoing way of being. Also take a look at the fact that the origin of the church does not lie in the calling of the apostles, but in the little room in Nazareth, where the Son's yes to the Father became one with the Mother's yes to the incarnation of the Son. The church was already present in her before men were invested with office. Consider also the scene at the crucifixion. In one of Balthasar's books, it's Mysterium Paschali, he invites us to consider the account in John's Gospel. Now, to paraphrase Balthasar, he says, quote, "This gospel brings a mysterious clarification. At the foot of the cross was the church of love, in distinction to the absent church of office," unquote. Present there were the sorrowing mother and the disciple whom Jesus loved. It is this primordial church which stands by the cross, and this church is later addressed by Jesus to Peter as Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love me more than these?" The church of love is absorbed into and precedes the Petrine church. But even though the church of love, the Marian church, is absorbed into the Petrine church, the Marian church can never disappear. For if it did disappear, the church remaining would be one of function only. It would be administration without remaining in the Lord. The Petrine Principle serves to guarantee unity and ensure the sacramental mediation of that holiness which the Church already possesses in its Marian form. As an envoy, Peter is destined for the holy, loving Marian Church. Peter remains a member of the Marian Church. Now, these two principles, the Marian and the Petrine, serve to highlight Mary's perfect receptivity in the motherhood of the Church, and on the other hand, the office and institution carried out by Peter and his successors. These two principles are not merely speculations of Balthasar. Rather, they've been taken up by Popes St. John Paul, Benedict, Francis, and Leo. For example, in speaking to the members of the Curia who would certainly be devoted to implementing the Petrine Principle, Pope St. John Paul exhorted them that, quote, attention to Mary and her example brings more love, tenderness, and docility to the voice of the Spirit, so that each person's dedication to the service of Peter's ministry may be enriched interiorly, end quote. So for John Paul, the hierarchy is to be led by Mary, so that the hierarchy's service of Peter might be what Mary's son would ask of them. Pope Francis was more direct in his speaking about these two principles. For example, he said, a church with only the Petrine Principle would be a church that could be thought of as reduced to its ministerial dimension, nothing more. Instead, the church is much more than a ministry. It is the whole people of God. The church is a woman. The church is a bride. For this reason, the dignity of women is reflected in this way. And that's the end of quote from Pope Francis. And going on, Pope Francis also said, quote, the Marian ministry is greater because it is a ministry of unity that involves others. The Petrine is a ministry of management. The maternal nature of the church is the maternal nature of a woman. The Marian principle is more important than the Petrine principle because there the church is a bride, the church is a woman. End quote from Pope Francis. And then finally, we have this line from Pope Leo, quote, it is precisely the Marian pole with its motherhood, gift of Christ and of the Spirit that ensures the faithfulness and holiness of the Petrine pole principle, end of quote. So again and again, we see how the Marian principle feeds, nurtures, and leads the Petrine principle. Even so, as I noted at the outset, there can be a suspicion that these are only words used to hide gender stereotyping. The objection is raised that the gentleness of Mary is lifted up only as it's a consolation prize to women who will not generally exercise the Petrine ministry of administration in the hierarchy. Instead, it is proposed that it is not our sexual difference that is determinative in our life in the church. Rather, it should be the fact of our divine filiation, our all being born of the Father, men and women. That's what makes a difference. To that end, some have tendered a third principle, that of the Johannine principle. Here our life would be modeled on the beloved disciple and John's contemplative closeness to Jesus, a closeness founded on love. So we have three models available to us, Mary's, Peter's, and John's. Which do we follow? I will suggest that all three of them, to one degree or another, should guide our lives as disciples of Jesus. What I will also suggest is that the two opening questions I asked are dumb, or better said, they're premised upon a confused understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. When we ask who's in charge or who's more important, what are we doing but imposing values of the broken world on a spiritual question? Asking whether Mary or Peter is greater or more in charge reminds me of the quarreling disciples who were disputing with James and John, who were seeking to be seated at the right and left hand of Jesus in his kingdom. Matthew's gospel relates how Jesus rejects this kind of thinking. He says, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. End quote. So, Marian Principle, Petrine, Johannine. I would conclude that without both the Marian and the Johannine spirituality, the Petrine Principle runs the risk of having governance, but governance without the heart of Mary and John. Now that would be dumb. God bless you. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. God bless.